president's Iraq policy. And we're back now with Britt, Elizabeth, Bill, and Juan. Well, after years of investigation and press speculation, we finally found out who apparently was the original source of the leak that Valarie claimed Joe Wilson's wife was in fact the wife of Joe Wilson. I'll get it straight here. And you see the cast of characters there. No, it wasn't Karl Rove. No, it wasn't Scooter Libby, the Vice President's former Chief of Staff. It was former Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage. Let's break this down into a few areas, Bill, Crystal. What does it tell us about Colin Powell, the then Secretary of State, and his then Deputy, Rich Armitage, that they apparently let the White House twist in the wind for years when they knew that it was Armitage, not somebody at the White House, who had originally leaked Valarie Plame's name and identity?
Well, it might be that Fitzgerald asked them not to speak publicly. I think he has asked other people involved in the case not to speak publicly, and in which case I would then say I don't think Powell and Armitage have covered themselves with glory, but on the other hand, what was Fitzgerald doing? He knew before he began his investigation that who the source of the leak was.
But go ahead.
Well, look.
We're going to get to Fitzgerald in a minute, but let's talk about the State Department.
Talking about, but let's talk a minute about Armitage. In the early phases, it might indeed have been so that he'd asked people not to comment on their grand jury testimony. That's merely a request from a prosecutor. That's to speak. You have an absolute legal right to discuss your own grand jury testimony. It's an absolute legal right. So that doesn't entirely excuse Armitage, and it certainly doesn't excuse Armitage now. I mean, the investigation is all but complete. Armitage knows he's not going to be indicted, although he was the original source of all this. And now it's been out for a week that he was the one. He has a lot to explain. He has said nothing. His former boss, Colin Powell, has said nothing. They have continued to allow these allegations to stand, and only somebody else's information about them has begun to put this to rest.
Elizabeth, let me move forward to the next player in this drama, and that's Patrick Fitzgerald, the special prosecutor, who we now learn that when he took over in December of 2003 and began this investigation, he already knew, because Armitage had already told federal investigators that Armitage, not the people in the White House, was the original leak.
But without saying anything, I mean, first of all, I just want to say I'm opposed to all leak investigations. As a reporter in Washington, I like leaks. I don't care what kind they are. We like leaks. That's how we find things out. And so let me just say that. But secondly, to answer your question, I think there were other people who had talked to reporters, and that was what he was after. It turned out Karl Rove did talk to reporters, Scooter Libby did talk to reporters, so that's what he was looking for.
The problem with that is that the only so-called leak, and I don't believe that for any meaningful purposes there ever was a leak. I think Armitage's so-called leak was entirely innocent. But the fact is, the only one that made a difference, without which none of this would have happened, was the Armitage comment to Novak. Novak was the one who revealed the identity of Valarie Plame, Joe Wilson's wife, as being CIA. And that was the only one that had any consequential effect. Other reporters heard about it, but they never did anything with it because it didn't occur to them or it didn't happen. So the only effective release of this information that made a difference was that one. Once he knew how that one had come about, the investigation, in my view, should have been over.
Let me move on. Juan, and I'll bring you up here to the next player in all of this, and that is Joe Wilson, the aggrieved husband of Valarie Plame. In an editorial this week, the Washington Post, which ran with the story just as much as anybody else did, in this editorial, the Post said it now appears that the person most responsible for the end of Ms. Plame's CIA career is Mr. Wilson, her husband. Question: where does Joe Wilson's credibility stand now?
His credibility, first, saying that somehow that Iraq had not been seeking yellow cake uranium in Niger turned out to be wrong. And so that's at the base of his credibility. I think that hurts, because he, in the piece, made the suggestion somehow that he had undermined the basis for the pre-war intelligence as it was being gathered by the White House. But to come back to something Britt was saying, if in fact the White House, and the White House had a White House Iraq group, and Scooter Libby, Louis Libby, the Vice President Chief of Staff, was on that group, if he asked for a memo intending to rebut Joe Wilson's charges, because the administration was concerned about what Joe Wilson had to say, and viewed it as a threat to the basis that they were going to war, and then that memo gets to Armitage, and Armitage sees it, Armitage possibly learns from that memo that Valarie Flame is a CIA operative, and then says it coincidentally to Novak.
The prosecutor investigated that. He didn't find that. If he had found that, presumably there was a deliberate leak, a malicious leak of some kind, he would have been prosecuted for it.
I didn't say that it was a leak. I said he commissioned a memo intended to rebut Wilson. It circulates. Armitage sees it. Armitage, in passing, references this to Novak.
All right, guys.
But the point is that the White House, you can have two things happening at one time, Britt. You can have the White House going after their critics at the same time that Armitage says this in passing to Novak.
Rebutting your critics is a legal thing to do.
Correct.
And this was criminalized. Scooter Libby has been indicted for something that was not a crime and for a leak that he was not responsible
now that
for.
brings us, thank you very much, Mr.
my
President,
best
to the
field.
final player and the person who's really been punished, the only one is so far who's really been punished in this whole thing, Scooter Libby, the Vice President's former Chief of Staff, because he's the one who's been charged and now has to pay huge legal fees trying to defend himself on charges of obstruction of justice and perjury.
Bush was not told by Powell or Armitage who the source of the leak was. Ashcroft appointed an independent counsel who got totally out of control. He had to indict someone, I suppose, he felt, in December of 2003, which never should have happened. Bush should pardon Libby. He should do it now. It would be fantastic. The Democrats would go crazy. We could have a debate for 2 months about whether one should criminalize what was a totally innocent attempt to respond to, as Juan said, a mendacious critic of the administration. It's really an outrage. The one guy indicted here is Libby, and the outrage is that criminalizing works. You know, I mean, he was forced to leave the White House.
But we are still talking about disclosing someone's identity. That it's still in the gray area, possibly being a crime. So I think it's not.
No, but has Libby been charged with that crime? No.
But
there's no underlying crime.
No one has been charged.
But he has been charged with lying to a grand jury, and he lied to a grand jury.
And the things he allegedly forgot about are much less consequential than what Richard Armitage forgot. Richard Armitage forgot for 3 months that he had talked to Novak. He forgot for 2 years that he had talked to Bob Woodward 3 weeks before he talked to Novak. Richard Armitage has not been indicted, and he shouldn't be. The idea that Libby's indicted for less serious memory...
Did he lie?
No,
Or didn't he lie?
He didn't lie in any serious meaning of lying before a grand jury.
There are a couple other players that
We got 20 seconds left.
And those are leading members of the news media who continued to take Joe Wilson's charges seriously, even after they had been discredited by the Senate Intelligence Committee and others, and who have stayed on this story believing there was something there all this time until now.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you all, panel. More to discuss. See you all next week.